Racist cop throws hot coffee at woman, not knowing she's the new police chief. Sometimes fate arranges the unlikeliest of encounters. Imagine a busy morning in downtown Chicago, a line of impatient customers at a Starbucks, and a rude, arrogant police officer looking for trouble before he's even clocked in. He never expected that the woman he disrespected so boldly and so violently would soon be his new boss. But life loves poetic justice, and justice has a way of striking back even harder when prejudice meets power. Today, you'll witness a remarkable story of wrongdoing and redemption, a tale that proves you never really know who you're dealing with or how your actions might come back around. The bright yellow sun inched above the Chicago skyline, illuminating streets already bustling with cars and pedestrians. It was a Thursday, often called the most hectic day of the work week in many circles. At 7:45 a.m., the line at the Starbucks on West Monroe Street extended all the way to the entrance, filled with bleary-eyed office workers in pencil skirts and pressed suits. Everyone was desperate for a jolt of caffeine before facing another day of emails, meetings, and deadlines. Inside the cafe, the hum of espresso machines clashed with the soft melodies piped in through the speakers. Baristas, working tirelessly, called out names and placed drinks on the counter in rapid succession. The store manager, Shauna, tried to maintain a cheerful smile as she offered a freshly brewed Pike Place to a grumpy businessman. This was the daily hustle, and each day brought its own small dramas and frantic moments. In a corner of the cafe, a particularly boisterous figure made his presence known. Officer Charles Chuck Doyle stood out, partly because of the crisp Chicago Police Department uniform he wore, but mostly because of his demeanor. Towering close to 6'3" with a barrel chest, he looked imposing, and he acted like it too. He hadn't yet clocked into the station. Ostensibly, this was his personal time, but he couldn't help barking orders as though everyone around him was a suspect. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the counter. "What's taking so long?" He snapped at the barista. "Sir, we'll have your coffee out in just a minute," the barista assured him. "That's what you said 5 minutes ago," Chuck hissed, though in truth, it had only been 2. He rolled his eyes, scanning the crowd. Most people averted their gaze, not wanting to draw his ire. Just then, the door swung open, letting in a gust of brisk autumn air. A woman in her early 40s stepped inside, her posture upright and confident despite wearing plain civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer, black slacks, and a white blouse. Her hair, neatly styled in a short, professional cut, reflected soft highlights under the overhead lights. She took in the scene with a quick glance, and for a moment, her gaze lingered on Chuck Doyle. Her eyes narrowed imperceptibly, but she said nothing as she joined the queue. Officer Doyle, noticing her peripherally, let out a loud, exasperated sigh. "Great," he muttered under his breath, "just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Another one." The barista handed him his hot coffee, a Grand Americano, with an extra shot, and scurried away. As the woman in the blazer moved up in line, the tension in the air seemed to heighten. Chuck glared at her with annoyance, though she had done absolutely nothing to provoke him. She offered him the faintest of polite smiles before turning her attention back to the menu. Chuck's irritation flickered into something uglier. He took a step closer, as if daring her to look at him again. It was an ordinary morning in so many ways, yet destiny had plans to transform this mundane coffee run into an unforgettable reckoning. The woman in the navy blazer, whose name was Dr. Victoria Vicky Green, thought she was used to the hustle of busy mornings. After a distinguished career in the military police, she had spent years in administrative roles overseeing complex operations. Although somewhat new to Chicago, she'd done her homework, memorizing the city's labyrinthine streets and soaking up the police department's organizational chart. She was poised to begin a new role that very morning as the Chicago Police Department's incoming deputy superintendent, a fact known to only a select few on the city council. Today she was to be introduced as a surprise appointment for an even bigger role, the brand new chief of police for the city's central district. The official announcement would come in less than 3 hours, but for now, she was just another customer waiting for her coffee. As Vicky stood in line, she could feel the hostility radiating off Officer Doyle like a heat lamp. She picked up on details most would overlook, the way he leaned forward aggressively, his eyes scanning for perceived threats, his tense grip on the coffee cup. Her gut told her that something was off. She had encountered men like him before, authority figures who wore their badge like a personal license to bully. Still, she was off duty, and she certainly wasn't looking for a confrontation. She glanced at her watch. She wanted to make a good impression by arriving early for her big day at the station. "Hey, lady," Chuck barked, stepping into her personal space. A hush seemed to fall around them. "You got a problem?" Vicky's eyes moved from her watch to meet his. "Not at all, officer," she said calmly. "Just waiting for my turn. Same as you." Chuck let out a derisive snort. "Funny, you're staring at me like I'm some kind of zoo animal." "I was simply looking around," Vicky replied, her voice controlled. "If my gaze fell on you, I apologize." No disrespect intended. Her measured tone seemed to infuriate Chuck further. He glanced around, noticing people were starting to watch. Some pulled out their phones. Part of him knew he was on precarious footing, especially in uniform, but his ego and prejudice got the better of him. "You city folks," he sneered, "always got a chip on your shoulder. Think you can just—" Vicky cut him off politely but firmly. "Officer, I have no quarrel with you. Let's both take a step back and continue our day without incident. We have a duty to the community after all." If Chuck was taken aback by her use of we, he didn't show it. Instead, he spat out, "Don't tell me about duty. I'm the one who puts my life on the line every day. I don't need lectures from some—" He paused, biting back words that threatened to reveal more about his mindset than he might want. Suddenly, one of the baristas called, "Dr. Green, your order is ready." In that tense moment, Chuck heard the name but didn't connect it to anything official. If anything, Dr. Green sounded academic. It only added to his contempt. Taking a slow breath, Vicky tried to diffuse the situation. She stepped forward to pick up her drink, yet, for reasons that would become pivotal, Chuck refused to let it go. Instead, he moved, almost stepping on her toes. In a swift, jarring motion, he accidentally jostled her, sending her coffee cup flying out of her hand. The hot liquid splashed across her blazer, staining it. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Vicky recoiled, the searing heat surprising her more than truly burning her. Chuck could have backed off, apologized, or even looked concerned, but his face twisted into something cruel. "Serves you right," he said with a sneer, gripping his own cup tightly. Vicky stared at him in disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, to check if he understood the gravity of what he'd just done. But before any words could form, Chuck tilted his cup ever so slightly and deliberately flung a splash of his steaming coffee at her feet. Some of it splattered up onto her pants. "Oof," he said mockingly. Shocked gasps and murmurs filled the cafe. Several bystanders instinctively took steps toward Vicky, offering napkins, sympathy, and condemnation of Chuck's actions. Phones were now clearly recording. The line between accident and assault had just been crossed in the eyes of many witnesses, but Chuck stood defiant. He glared at Vicky with an unsettling mix of smugness and challenge. He had no idea that the woman he'd just assaulted was about to become his new chief. The tension in the Starbucks was almost palpable as everyone held their breath to see what would happen next. Vicky pressed a napkin against her blazer, trying to blot away the worst of the coffee stains. Her heart pounded, not in fear, but in controlled anger. She was still processing the fact that an officer of the law, a man sworn to serve and protect, had just thrown hot coffee at her, seemingly just because he'd convinced himself she'd looked at him wrong. How many times had she read about similar situations in complaint reports? But this was happening to her now. The manager, Shauna, approached with worry etched into her features. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help? Should I call someone?" Vicky managed a tight smile. "I'm all right." A little shaken up, but no serious harm, Chuck cleared his throat loudly. "Don't bother. This is just a misunderstanding." He pivoted to Vicky. "Isn't that right?" His tone was menacing, a barely concealed threat that said, "You better agree, or else." Vicky took a breath. Her instinct was to identify herself, to pull rank and show him exactly who he was dealing with. But a nagging thought held her back. Revealing her position in the heat of anger could look like an abuse of power, and she wanted no part of that. A good leader, she reminded herself, keeps calm under pressure. One of the customers, an elderly woman in a neat wool coat, intervened. "Officer, that was uncalled for," she exclaimed. "You should apologize." Chuck's glare swept the cafe, daring anyone else to speak up. "This is police business," he announced, puffing up his chest. "Stay out of it." But the crowd was no longer on his side. People began murmuring words like brutality, unprofessional, and report this. More phones pointed in Chuck's direction. A wave of fear flickered across his face as he realized he was now the center of a viral moment. Yet pride wouldn't let him back down. Vicky straightened her shoulders. "Officer," she said evenly, "you've taken this too far. You assaulted me with hot coffee. This is unacceptable behavior, not just for a police officer, but for any human being." Chuck took a menacing step closer. The coffee in his cup sloshed around, though now only half full. His knuckles turned white from the force of his grip. "I don't like your attitude," he hissed. "People like you think you can walk in here and—" Vicky lifted a hand in a gesture of peace. "Enough. There's no need to escalate. I'd like your badge number and name, officer. I'll be filing a formal complaint." A hush fell again. Chuck stared at her, incredulous, as though no one had ever dared speak to him that way. "If only you knew who I am," Vicky thought, resisting the urge to reveal her identity. "Finally," Chuck sneered, "file whatever you want. Good luck making it stick." He turned to Shauna and demanded, "Give me a napkin, now." Shauna, visibly trembling, handed over a stack of napkins. Chuck wiped a few stray coffee droplets off his uniform and started toward the door. Just before stepping out, he threw one last glare at Vicky. "Next time, watch yourself." Then he pushed open the door and disappeared onto the busy sidewalk. The tension he left behind felt like a storm had passed through, swirling chairs and scattering morale. Vicky exhaled slowly and accepted the napkins from Shauna, feeling the weight of eyes upon her. She glanced around at the sympathetic faces. She forced a polite smile. "Thank you. I appreciate everyone's concern." Someone in the crowd piped up, "What are you going to do now?" Vicky swallowed. She already knew the answer, but she offered a gentle reply. "First, I'm going to change into something that isn't soaking wet with coffee. Then, I'm going to the police station to handle some business." Little did they know that she was about to address this incident from the highest seat in the district. Barely an hour later, Officer Chuck Doyle clocked into the Chicago Central Police Station. The imposing limestone building on South State Street had been standing for nearly a century, a testament to the city's storied history of law enforcement. The station's interior bustled with detectives, uniformed officers, and administrative personnel, all weaving through corridors adorned with plaques, historical photos, and motivational posters featuring the CPD motto, "We serve and protect." Chuck was still simmering with anger. The Starbucks encounter lingered in his mind, especially the part where that woman had demanded his badge number. He convinced himself she was just some mouthy civilian with a grudge against law enforcement. She won't get anywhere, he thought. People complain all the time. Nothing ever sticks. In the locker room, Chuck removed his slightly coffee-stained uniform shirt and swapped it for a clean one, muttering under his breath. Another officer, Marty Delgado, noticed his foul mood. "Rough morning?" Marty asked, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "You could say that," Chuck grumbled, glancing away. "Just had a run-in with a real piece of work at Starbucks. Tossed coffee on me, can you believe that?" Marty raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "I thought I saw a video floating around on social media. Someone said an officer threw coffee on a woman." "That wasn't you, was it?" Chuck's face darkened. "Rumors," he spat. "Don't believe everything you see online." Sensing the tension, Marty wisely let the subject drop. "Well, heads up, there's a special briefing in the assembly hall at 9 a.m. The commissioner's supposed to make some big announcement." "Great," Chuck said, slamming his locker shut. Another bureaucrat, probably. More paperwork, more nonsense. The two men left the locker room, strolling through the station's corridors. On their way, they passed a glass-enclosed bulletin board featuring a large, bold headline, "Welcome the new chief of Chicago's Central District." The sheet underneath was blank, waiting for the official name and photo to be posted once the announcement was made. Chuck barely gave it a glance. New leadership was a revolving door in Chicago, as far as he was concerned. When the clock struck 9 a.m., Chuck and a crowd of officers, detectives, and administrative staff funneled into the assembly hall, a functional, no-frills room with rows of metal chairs facing a podium. Commissioner Laura Henderson, a tall, formidable woman in her early 50s, stood at the front. A sharp gaze swept over the gathering. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "Thank you for being here. Today is a momentous day for our district. As you know, we've been without a permanent chief for some months now, and I'm pleased to announce that the City Council, along with the mayor, has confirmed our new chief of the Chicago Central District." A ripple of curious murmurs moved through the crowd. Chuck shifted from foot to foot, arms crossed. "Let's just get this over with," he thought. Henderson continued, "It is my honor to introduce Dr. Victoria Green, a highly decorated former military police officer and someone with extensive experience in law enforcement administration. She has served in multiple leadership roles around the country, and we believe she will bring a fresh perspective to our department." The side door opened, and in walked Vicky, sporting a crisp navy blue police chief's uniform with a shining badge pinned to her chest. The transformation from Starbucks attire to this commanding presence was striking. Her gaze swept across the crowd, but she showed no emotion, especially none of the shock she felt upon spotting Officer Chuck Doyle among the throng. An audible gasp fluttered through a handful of officers who recognized her from the circulating viral video. Chuck's eyes bulged as if he'd seen a ghost. No, it can't be her. His mind scrambled to rationalize the surreal moment. But there she stood, the woman he'd disrespected, assaulted, and threatened, stepping up to the podium to take command. Standing at the microphone, Chief Victoria Green took a moment to compose herself. This was no ordinary introduction. She'd thought she might see Chuck eventually, just not so soon, and certainly not from a vantage point that broadcast her authority over him. She cleared her throat, feeling a surge of determination. "Good morning," she addressed the assembly. "It is a privilege to stand before you as your new chief. I believe in fairness, justice, and professionalism. I look forward to working closely with each and every one of you to ensure we uphold the values of the Chicago Police Department. We are entrusted with the safety of our community, and that trust must never be broken." Her gaze locked on Chuck for the briefest second, his face drained of color. "He knows," she realized. "He knows exactly who I am, but she continued with her speech, every word laced with resolve. She might have set aside her personal anger for this moment of professional duty, but she would not and could not forget what Chuck had done. For Chuck Doyle, the morning had gone from simple annoyance to a bone-chilling realization. He was in serious trouble, and by the look in her eyes, he knew he deserved every bit of it. Chuck Doyle felt as though the fluorescent lights in the assembly hall had turned into spotlights, exposing him for all to see. The new chief, that woman, as he kept calling her in his mind, stood at the podium, graciously accepting applause and nodding her thanks as Commissioner Henderson concluded the introduction. The commissioner offered a firm handshake and stepped aside. Vicky took a breath and spoke again, her voice strong yet measured. I want to meet with each department head over the next few weeks to understand current challenges and gather insights. My door will be open. We'll hold a Q&A session shortly, but for now, let's get back to our duties. Thank you, everyone. A smattering of applause followed. People began to file out, but Chuck felt rooted to the spot. His mind was spinning in a vortex of worry. A part of him considered slipping out of the hall unnoticed, but it was too late. Vicky stepped down from the dais, and although many officers thronged to offer polite greetings, she made a direct path toward him. He swallowed, forced a smile he didn't feel, and feigned ignorance. "Chief, congratulations," he said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Vicky offered a tight smile in return, her eyes unreadable. "Officer Doyle, correct?" "Yes," he managed. His heart was pounding so loud he wondered if she could hear it. "I'm looking forward to getting acquainted with the officers here," she said, every word precise. "Perhaps we can have a chat later this afternoon." Her tone sounded deceptively friendly, but Chuck could sense the unyielding steel behind her composure. Marty Delgado, who had been standing a few feet away, glanced at Chuck, confused by the undercurrent of tension. Chuck forced another grin. "Sure, absolutely," he replied. "Whenever is convenient. I'll have my assistant, Miss Carey, schedule something," Vicky said. Her eyes held Chuck's for a moment longer. Then she turned away to greet another group of officers. Chuck exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "She's playing nice in public," he thought with dread. "But behind closed doors, I'm done for." As he left the assembly hall, his mind cycled through possible scenarios. Could he spin the Starbucks incident, claim it was blown out of proportion, or maybe suggest she was the aggressor? The presence of bystanders, camera phones, and the Starbucks manager's potential testimony all made it highly unlikely. And the new chief had a squeaky clean record from what he'd just gleaned. She was no pushover. Passing a group of colleagues in the corridor, Chuck tried to act normal. But the pit in his stomach grew heavier when he heard whispers. "That's the cop from the video. He's in deep trouble, and I heard she's pressing charges." The rumor mill was working overtime. He ducked into a side hallway, scanning the area to ensure privacy before fishing out his phone. There was a frantic text from an unknown number. "I have footage from this morning if you need it." He didn't even know who the person was or how they got his number, but the message confirmed the incident was out in the open. Too many eyes, too many angles. He was trapped in a corner of his own making. "Stay calm," he told himself. "There's always a way out." But even as he tried to reassure himself, a cold sweat dampened his collar. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. One moment of bigotry and temper had taken root, and now it threatened to tear down everything he'd built in his career. He made a beeline for the restroom, locked the stall door, and sat down. Think, Chuck, think. The only plan that came to mind was to deny, deflect, and do whatever it took to protect his badge. Little did he know that the karmic hammer looming over him would strike harder than he ever anticipated. By mid-afternoon, Chief Vicky Green had settled into her new office. The space was Spartan but functional: white walls, a single filing cabinet, a bookshelf, and a sturdy wooden desk. A Chicago PD flag stood in one corner, while a large window behind the desk overlooked the busy city street. Stacks of paperwork and new directives awaited her signature. Yet, she couldn't stop her thoughts from drifting back to that morning's encounter. Officer Chuck Doyle. The name seemed almost innocuous, belying the hatred and disrespect she'd witnessed firsthand. She recalled the cold splash of coffee on her clothes, the cruelty in his eyes, and the shock of seeing him walk away without any remorse. Vicky prided herself on her fairness. She had served as a military police captain in Afghanistan, navigating conflicts where personal bias could mean life or death. She believed in second chances when warranted, but not without accountability. If Chuck thought she would just bury the incident, he was sorely mistaken. We can't have officers who tarnish the badge like that. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. In stepped Miss Carey, a petite woman with a no-nonsense bob and a determined expression. She held a tablet in one hand. "Chief, I've scheduled your meeting with Officer Doyle for 3:30. Is that all right?" Vicky nodded. "That's perfect. Thank you, Miss Carey. Also, can we get a preliminary overview of any recorded complaints or disciplinary actions in Officer Doyle's file before then?" Miss Carey tapped on her tablet. "Yes, ma'am. I've got the internal reports loaded up, and I can give you a summary. According to the files, Doyle has been with the CPD for 6 years. He's had 2 prior complaints for use of excessive force, one from 2 years ago, another from 5 months ago, but both were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. He also has a few minor citations for insubordination, nothing severe on paper, but there's a pattern of friction." Vicky pressed her lips together. "I see. Thank you. Please print the relevant documents. I want to be thorough." Miss Carey nodded and left the office. Vicky leaned back in her chair, letting the gravity of the situation settle. He's not a one-time offender. He's been skating by, possibly with some immunity or a lack of proper scrutiny. She inhaled deeply. "Not under my watch," she whispered to herself. A few minutes later, her desk phone buzzed. "Chief Commissioner Henderson on line 1, Miss Carey's voice announced. Vicky lifted the receiver. "Commissioner, good afternoon." Henderson's composed voice filled the line. "Chief Green, I wanted to touch base. We've received some external calls about a Starbucks video. It shows an officer allegedly, Chuck Doyle, throwing hot coffee on a civilian. That civilian appears to be you." Vicky exhaled. The video had made its rounds faster than she'd anticipated. "Yes, Commissioner. I was involved in an incident before coming in this morning. I plan to address it internally first. I trust you'll handle it professionally," the Commissioner replied. "The Mayor's office is aware, so please keep me updated. We're hoping to avoid public scandal, but we must show transparency. If formal charges are necessary, we'll support you. I'll wait for your assessment." "Thank you, Commissioner." "I appreciate the support," Vicky said. They exchanged goodbyes and ended the call. A sense of resolve rippled through Vicky. She had the Commissioner's backing and the moral high ground. Now she needed to approach this with the diligence it deserved. "That's the right thing to do for me, for the department, and for the public trust we're meant to uphold." Time ticked by as she arranged her notes and the evidence, statements from Starbucks witnesses who had called in or emailed after seeing the news, the partial video footage that had surfaced online, and Chuck's personnel file. Then, at 3:25, Miss Carey buzzed her phone again. "Chief, Officer Doyle is here." Vicky took a slow, steadying breath. "Send him in," she said. Her moment of confrontation had arrived. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Officer Chuck Doyle entered Chief Vicky Green's office. His posture was stiff and sweat beaded at his temples. Though he tried to exude confidence, the tension in his eyes betrayed his fear. He'd spent the day rehearsing a defense. Keep it simple, keep it vague, he'd told himself. Don't admit anything. Officer Doyle, Vicky greeted him, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Please, have a seat, he obliged, placing his cap in his lap and struggling not to fidget. Chief, he said in a tightly controlled tone. For a moment, silence reigned. Vicky studied him. Chuck avoided making direct eye contact. Finally, she folded her hands on the desk. We both know why you're here, she began. Let's address the incident at Starbucks this morning. I'd like to hear your account. Chuck coughed, looking up through lowered lashes. It was a misunderstanding, Chief. The woman, you got coffee on me first, and I reacted. I didn't realize who you were. If I'd known you were the new chief, I would have irrelevant. Vicky cut in, calmly. You do realize that my position shouldn't matter. What you did was unprofessional and, frankly, dangerous. It could have been anyone, an elderly person, a child, a pregnant woman. You threw hot coffee at a civilian. Chuck's jaw tensed. I just lost my cool. You were staring. You bumped me, causing me to spill coffee. Vicky reached for a folder and opened it, revealing printed screenshots from a video. These are stills taken from the footage posted on social media. Multiple witnesses have corroborated the story. The footage clearly shows you throwing coffee, not just spilling it. Chuck swallowed hard. The color drained from his face. I'm not going to deny it. But it was an accident, he insisted. Feebly, Vicky's expression remained neutral. Officer Doyle, I served in the military police and have dealt with countless investigations. I know the difference between an accident and a deliberate act. You had the opportunity to apologize or de-escalate. You chose otherwise. The officer's eyes flicked to the door, as though seeking escape. Chief, I've been with this force for 6 years. I've made mistakes, sure, but I'm dedicated. My record is good. I was under stress, personal issues. This morning was abnormal. Vicky nodded slightly, acknowledging the admission. Stress doesn't justify assault. We also have your file to consider. 2 previous allegations of excessive force, both dismissed due to lack of evidence. But I see a pattern of complaints suggesting potential misconduct. As the new chief, it's my responsibility to investigate such matters thoroughly. Chuck's face grew flushed. I understand, but I'm asking for leniency, Chief. I can't lose my job. Vicky leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. In that moment, she recalled all the times she'd believed in giving a second chance, but also her duty to maintain the integrity of the badge. I have the power to recommend disciplinary action, up to and including termination, she explained. But my goal is not just to punish, it's to uphold the standards that the Chicago Police Department and the public expect. She slid a sheet of paper across the desk. We'll conduct an official internal affairs investigation. Until it concludes, you're suspended with pay. Your badge and weapon must be surrendered immediately. Chuck's hand trembled as he picked up the paper and read the official notification. Suspended? Chief, Officer Doyle, consider this a mercy, Vicky said, her tone firm but even. I could have pushed for immediate termination and criminal charges, but I'm affording you due process. We'll see what the investigation turns up. Humiliation and anger mingled on Chuck's face. He rose, placing his cap back on his head as if trying to reclaim dignity. Thank you for the fairness, he mumbled, though it was evident he seethed underneath. Please hand over your badge and weapon to Miss Carey on your way out, Vicky reiterated, motioning to the door. The next steps will be communicated to you. If you have any questions, direct them to your union representative. Chuck hesitated, as though he had more to say, but ultimately turned and walked out. The office door shut behind him with a soft click. Vicky let out a slow exhale, feeling a cocktail of relief and residual anger. A suspended officer under investigation, she mused. At least It's a start. She knew that the real test had only begun. Investigating Chuck's behavior would open up more complexities. Still, justice had to be done. And in her heart, she believed that sometimes dramatic events were exactly what was needed to ignite long overdue reform. News travels fast in the digital age, and the Starbucks incident involving Officer Chuck Doyle and newly appointed Chief Victoria Green became a city-wide talking point within hours. Local headlines read, "Racist officer under fire for assault on new chief," while social media buzzed with hashtags like #CoffeeCop and #ChiefGreen. Some sensational tabloids plastered Chuck's face right next to Vicky's, fueling public outrage. In the aftermath, the Chicago Central Police Station's public information officer scrambled to handle inquiries from reporters. Statements were carefully crafted to maintain professionalism without revealing too many details. In coffee shops, bars, and workplaces across the city, Chicagoans debated the situation. "She should throw the book at him," said a mother of two, Sarah Meeks, as she sipped her latte at the same Starbucks where the incident occurred. "We can't have law enforcement officers who think it's okay to assault people just because they can." Others worried about the department's reputation. "Stuff like this sets us back," complained an off-duty officer named Tanya, speaking to her friends at a local diner. "We work so hard to build trust, and one guy's bad attitude can make everyone suspicious of us again." Meanwhile, community activists saw the incident as a catalyst. Jaden Williams, a prominent local figure in police reform, organized a small rally outside City Hall. "We demand accountability," he announced into a megaphone. "This is not just about one cop and one chief. It's about a system that too often protects officers who abuse their power. Let this be a turning point." As for Chuck Doyle himself, he spent those first days of suspension holed up in his modest apartment on the South Side. The blinds stayed drawn, the phone calls went unanswered, and the TV buzzed with news segments that made him cringe. His own name and face flashed on the screen, linked with words like racism, assault, and investigation. He tried to silence the coverage by flipping channels, but it felt like everyone was talking about him. Even the sports station he usually watched made a joke about that coffee throwing cop during a commercial break. Defeated, he turned off the TV and paced his living room. His mind was a churning whirlpool of regret, resentment, and denial. He wanted to blame Vicky Green for everything, but deep down he couldn't escape the truth. He had made this bed. His arrogance, stoked by biases he refused to acknowledge, had led him here. Now the city scorned him, his colleagues whispered about him, and the future of his career lay in tatters. Back at the station, Chief Green was anything but idle. Between meetings with department heads and introducing new protocols for community engagement, she found time to liaise with internal affairs on the status of the investigation. Each day, more witness statements surfaced, along with additional videos from bystanders at Starbucks. The evidence painted a grim picture for Chuck's defense. Yet for all her measured professionalism, Vicky couldn't entirely dismiss the personal ache behind this fiasco. She'd come to Chicago with a vision for positive change, not expecting her first high-profile action to be taking down a fellow officer for blatant misconduct. It was necessary, but also a stark reminder that leadership sometimes demanded immediate and painful decisions. Within a week, the city reached a boiling point. Every conversation, from local radio talk shows to family dinner tables, circled back to the Starbucks assault. Everyone wanted to see what Chief Green would do next. The question was, would the new chief truly follow through on accountability, or would this turn into another story of a cop getting a slap on the wrist? For Vicky, there was no choice at all. She had a job to do, and she planned to do it come what may. 2 weeks passed since Chuck Doyle's suspension, and the Internal Affairs IA investigation was in full swing. Chief Victoria Green had mandated that IA compile an exhaustive report on Chuck's conduct. But it soon became clear the problem ran deeper than just one officer's behavior. As IA investigators interviewed people at the station, they stumbled upon stories of a small clique of officers who shared Chuck's abrasive style, if not his outright racism. Allegations emerged of cover-ups, mishandled arrest reports, and intimidation tactics. The more threads IA pulled, the more the department's underbelly unraveled. Sitting in her office, Vicky pored over interim findings. She highlighted relevant points, made margin notes, and cross-referenced them with Chuck's known associates. Each new revelation fueled her resolve to clean house, yet it also weighed on her spirit. She recalled her pledge during her swearing-in to restore faith in the badge. This was precisely the fight she'd signed up for, but it was more extensive than she'd anticipated. Late that evening, Miss Carey knocked on the door. "Chief, do you have a moment?" Vicky rubbed her eyes and motioned for her to come in. "Of course, I've been going through old personnel records," Miss Carey said, placing a heavy folder on Vicky's desk. "I think you'll find this interesting." She flipped it open to reveal a series of memos and complaints from community members, all involving Chuck or officers associated with him. Though many were dismissed, the repeated accusations painted a pattern: harassment during routine stops, racial slurs overheard but never officially reported, and questionable use of force. In one instance, a formal complaint vanished from the system under suspicious circumstances. Vicky's jaw tightened. "Why was this never properly investigated?" Miss Carey sighed. "Different chiefs, different priorities. Some were too swamped. Others may have been reluctant to dig in for fear of backlash or negative press. The union can be quite powerful, and in some cases, evidence was inconclusive. But with your push for thoroughness, all this is resurfacing." Gazing at the folder, Vicky felt a mix of anger and determination. This is more than a single officer losing his temper. "Thank you, Miss Carey," she said. "Keep at it. We're shining a light on everything, no matter whose feathers get ruffled." As Miss Carey left, Vicky glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. She realized she hadn't even eaten dinner yet, but her appetite was overshadowed by the mission at hand. She picked up the phone, dialing Commissioner Henderson's private line. "Chief Green," Henderson answered after the second ring. "Working late, I see." "Yes, Commissioner. I've got some developments on the Doyle investigation," Vicky began. "It's bigger than we thought. There may be a network of officers engaging in or enabling unethical behavior." A silence lingered. When Henderson spoke again, her tone was grave. "Do what needs to be done, Chief. The Mayor and I fully support a top-to-bottom review if necessary. The city won't tolerate corruption or racism within our ranks." The call ended with mutual resolve. Vicky set down the phone and stared out the window at the shimmering city lights. "Chicago deserves better than rotten cops. We're going to clean this up, one way or another." In the days that followed, the IA interviews continued with renewed vigor. Rumors spread through the station like wildfire, stoking anxiety. Officers who harbored no guilt went about their business, but those who had cut corners turned blind eyes, or worse, began to sweat. Even Chuck's old partner, Marty Delgado, found himself in an uncomfortable position. Although he had not engaged in blatant misconduct, he suspected Chuck's racially charged attitude and never spoke up. Now, that silence felt like complicity. Meanwhile, Chuck remained isolated at home, each day dreading a phone call telling him he was officially fired. He roamed his apartment like a restless animal, chain-smoking and cursing everyone Chief Green, the department, the city. Deep down, he knew it was his fault. But admitting that would mean facing the darkest parts of himself, and that was a confrontation he wasn't ready for. The stage was set. A chief determined to clean up the force, a suspended officer whose actions had triggered a storm, and a department at risk of imploding from internal rot. All that remained was for the final cards to fall, and they would, inevitably, with unyielding force. A month after the fateful Starbucks incident, the internal affairs investigation neared completion. Chief Victoria Green reviewed the preliminary report, which was as thorough as it was damning. Testimonies from multiple officers, combined with community complaints and newly found evidence, painted a stark portrait of misconduct. Chuck Doyle was the focal point, but it turned out he was not alone in perpetuating a toxic subculture within the department. Emails were uncovered in which Chuck and two other officers used racist slang. Bodycam footage from prior incidents footage that had never been properly submitted revealed harsh verbal altercations. In some clips, Chuck appeared to provoke individuals during routine stops, raising tensions unnecessarily. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer it became that Chuck thrived on intimidation, particularly aimed at people of color. One chilly morning, Vicky assembled her command staff and IA investigators in a closed-door meeting. She spoke succinctly, her tone carrying the weight of moral and legal authority. "We will proceed with termination proceedings for Officer Doyle. The evidence is overwhelming, and we have an obligation to act. The other implicated officers will also face disciplinary action up to dismissal." No one in the room objected. The sense of relief was palpable relief that the department could finally excise a malignant element, even if it caused short-term controversy. Vicky leaned forward. "Commissioner Henderson and the Mayor's office are preparing a press statement. I'll address the media tomorrow morning, announcing the conclusion of this investigation. We'll also detail the new oversight policies designed to prevent future incidents." After the meeting adjourned, Vicky stayed behind with Miss Carey. The assistant offered a small, approving smile. "This is a major step, Chief." Vicky sighed, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's necessary, but it's also just the beginning. Reform is an ongoing process. I know there will be backlash, people who say we're not supporting our cops or that we're caving to public pressure, but this is about justice." Miss Carey nodded. "If you need anything, just let me know." That night, Chuck Doyle sat alone in his dimly lit living room, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey. A single phone call from his union rep had informed him he was to appear at the station for a final disciplinary hearing the following morning. The tone of the call said it all. There was no saving his job. What did I do to deserve this? Chuck asked himself, even though the answer was painfully evident. He was about to lose his livelihood, his standing in the community, and possibly his pension. Yet, beneath the anger and self-pity, a flicker of realization glimmered. I did this. I let my hatred rule me, but acknowledging that meant facing a swirling morass of shame he wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, he cursed Chief Green's name, the Starbucks baristas, the soft leadership who wouldn't back the badge, and everyone else he held responsible for his downfall. The next morning, as the sun crested over the Chicago River, Chuck trudged to the station like a man walking to the gallows. He avoided eye contact with officers who had once been his colleagues, but now watched him with a mixture of pity and condemnation. Upstairs, in a small conference room reserved for disciplinary hearings, Chuck took a seat at one side of a long table. On the other side sat Chief Green, two internal affairs officers, and a representative from the city's legal department. His union rep was beside him, but even they seemed resigned to the inevitable. Without grandstanding, Vicky presented the facts, the Starbucks assault, the pattern of complaints, the uncovered evidence, and the testimonies. Chuck mostly stared at the table, not daring to meet her gaze. When asked if he had anything to say, he muttered, "I'm sorry," but the words carried no weight. They were uttered too late, and with too little sincerity. At the conclusion, Vicky solemnly announced his termination from the Chicago Police Department. The finality of her words hit Chuck like a freight train. He thought about his father, a retired cop who once proudly pinned the badge on him at graduation. He imagined the shame on his parents' faces. He stood, numb, as the union rep guided him out of the room. The corridors that had once felt like home now felt like a funeral parlor. Officers averted their eyes or gave him cold stares. By the time he reached the station's exit, Chuck realized his fate. He was no longer Officer Doyle, just Chuck, a disgraced ex-cop with limited prospects. Karma had delivered its blow. The day after Chuck's termination, Chief Victoria Green held a press conference outside the Chicago Central Police Station. Flashes from camera crews lit up the crisp morning air. Reporters jostled for position, thrusting microphones forward to capture every word. Commissioner Henderson stood at Vicky's side, along with the city's mayor, Leon Jacobs. Dressed in her immaculate navy blue uniform, Vicky approached the podium, cleared her throat, and began, "Good morning." Over the past month, the Internal Affairs Division has been investigating multiple incidents of misconduct within our department. The most notable of these involved Officer Chuck Doyle, whose actions were caught on video. Today, I am announcing that Officer Doyle has been terminated from the Chicago Police Department, effective immediately. The gathered media erupted with questions, but Vicky held up a hand, signaling she wasn't finished. Moreover, several other officers found to be complicit or in violation of our professional standards are undergoing disciplinary actions. We are taking decisive steps to ensure integrity, accountability, and fairness within our ranks. She paused to glance at the crowd, spotting a few familiar faces from activist groups. Jaden Williams, the organizer of the City Hall rally, stood among them, listening intently. To the citizens of Chicago, Vicky continued, "I want to say I hear you and I see you. We understand the significance of public trust and the deep frustration that arises when officers betray the badge. My administration is committed to transparency and rigorous oversight. We will implement mandatory body cam usage with stricter enforcement, extensive bias training, and increased community engagement programs. We aim to make our streets safer, not only by addressing crime, but by building a genuine partnership with the people we serve." As soon as she wrapped up her statement, questions fired in rapid succession. "Chief Green, do you consider this a victory for police reform?" "Commissioner Henderson, what does the mayor's office say about potential lawsuits?" "Chief, are there more terminations expected?" Vicky answered calmly. "This isn't about victory or defeat. It's about doing the right thing. While I can't discuss pending investigations in detail, I can assure you that we'll maintain a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct." Nearby, a local news anchor whispered into the camera's microphone, "Chief Green is taking a strong stance. This marks a new chapter for the Chicago Police Department, one that's been long overdue, according to community activists." Back inside the station, the atmosphere was a curious blend of relief and residual tension. Many officers, especially those dedicated to honorable service, felt reinvigorated by the department's new direction. Others worried about what a more rigorous oversight regime might mean for their daily jobs. Nevertheless, the consensus was that something had shifted. A tide had turned. That afternoon, Vicky met with Jaden Williams and other community leaders in her office. She invited them to share their concerns and discuss ways to foster better relationships between law enforcement and residents. The dialogue was frank, sometimes heated, but ultimately productive. By the end of the meeting, handshakes were exchanged and future collaborations were scheduled. If anything, the Chuck Doyle incident had become a rallying cry for reform, forcing the department to look in the mirror and begin the hard work of change. Meanwhile, Chuck quietly vacated his apartment, fleeing the city to stay with a cousin in a distant suburb. He couldn't bear the shame or the potential stares of neighbors who might recognize him from the news. Late at night, in that suburban cousin's spare bedroom, he scrolled through social media posts, reading comment after comment praising Chief Green's swift action. Most pinned the blame squarely on him, and though it stung, he had no retort. For Vicky, there was no gloating, no victory lap. The woman who had arrived in Chicago anticipating a fresh start in leadership had instead found herself battling corruption from day one. Yet, in the quiet of her office, after a long day, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. We made a difference. We still have a long way to go, but at least we're on the right track. 6 months rolled by, bringing with them a palpable change in Chicago's Central Police District. The wave of reforms, introduced under Chief Victoria Green, took root, gradually restoring trust in the community. There were still challenges. Crime didn't vanish overnight, and not every officer embraced the changes willingly. But a renewed sense of integrity began permeating the department. Weekly community meet and greets gave residents the chance to voice concerns directly to officers. Bias training became mandatory, and the station's internal affairs unit expanded to handle an increased load of self-reported incidents. Officers were no longer afraid to speak up when they witnessed misconduct. A new oversight committee, composed of both civilians and law enforcement experts, kept the department accountable in ways never before seen in Chicago. On a warm spring evening, Vicky found herself once again at the Starbucks on West Monroe Street. This time, she stood in line not as a newly arrived outsider, but as a recognized figure. People offered friendly nods, and the baristas greeted her by name. "Dr. Green, sorry, Chief Green." "Shauna." The store manager beamed at her. "It's good to see you again. You've made such a difference in the neighborhood." Vicky smiled softly, recalling the chaotic scene months ago when she'd been doused in hot coffee. She ordered her usual, an Americano, with an extra shot, and chuckled at the memory. Fate certainly had a sense of irony. She paid for her drink and found a table in the corner to check her phone. A notification from the Chicago Tribune popped up. "Crime rates down 15% in Central District. Citizens credit police reform." She tapped the article and read with interest. The piece praised the new policies, quoting community members who felt safer and more respected by law enforcement. The final lines mentioned Chuck Doyle's incident as a catalyst for lasting change. Vicky sipped her Americano, reflecting on how a single moment of hate had propelled an entire department toward much-needed reform. It wasn't the path she had expected, but it had forced everyone, including her, to stand up and do what was right. Later that night, after a full day at the station, Vicky took a walk by the Chicago River. She leaned on the railing, gazing at the shimmering lights of the city reflected in the water. She thought about the people who had been brave enough to speak out, the officers who had shown true integrity, and even about Chuck Doyle, whose downfall had unintentionally served as the catalyst for transforming the department. Life often had strange ways of balancing the scales. Sometimes karma arrived in the form of a swift and undeniable justice. In Chuck's case, the consequences were dire and inescapable. He lost not only his job, but the identity he'd clung to so tightly. For Vicky and the department, that same incident became an unplanned turning point, ushering in an era of accountability and renewed faith in law enforcement. Standing there by the river, she felt gratitude for every difficult choice, every confrontation, every uncomfortable truth exposed. She pulled her blazer tighter around her shoulders as a breeze passed and stared out at the skyline. A new dawn has arrived in Chicago law enforcement, she thought, and we're just getting started. The story you've just witnessed isn't merely about one officer's downfall. It's a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. When a racist cop hurled hot coffee at an unsuspecting woman, he had no idea she was the new police chief who would hold him accountable. Yet that single reckless act spurred an entire department toward reform, proving that sometimes we need a shock to spark real change. If you found meaning in this tale of justice and transformation, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps bring more stories that shine a light on both the darkest corners and the brightest possibilities of our world. Let's continue to stand up against hate, champion accountability, and celebrate every victory, no matter how small, on our collective journey toward a just society. Thank you for watching.